Well, welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast, everybody. And today we're going on a deep dive into a fascinating topic.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be talking about renting land.
I
And
like this.
we're going to be using Muwatta Imam Malik as our source, specifically Book 34. And just to set the scene for our listeners,
Okay.
we're going all the way back to early Islamic history. We're going to kind of uncover how those early scholars viewed land ownership and how they viewed the use of that land.
Okay, this should be interesting because even today,
Yeah.
like land ownership is such a hot button issue. It's a
Absolutely.
big deal.
Absolutely. And it was a big deal then.
Mm.
And, you know, when you think about it, it might seem like a pretty straightforward concept.
Yeah.
But even way back then, there were different opinions. There were different, schools of thought, different interpretations on this whole idea of renting land.
Yeah, especially when you consider like the different ways it could be done.
Right.
Was it for money or for crops? There's
A
exactly.
lot of nuance there.
Yeah, like is it just a straight, I'm paying you X amount of gold
Yeah.
to rent this land, or is it, I'm giving you a portion of my harvest?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, is that we're going to uncover those different opinions.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right in.
Okay.
The Muwatta Imam Malik, like I said, is our source here. And we start with a hadith. And I always like to remind their listeners who may not be, super familiar with Islamic studies. A hadith is essentially a collection of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions.
They're really important because they provide guidance.
Exactly. They guide us on all kinds of matters, everything from prayer to, interactions with others, all sorts of stuff. And this particular hadith is narrated by Rafi ibn Khadij.
Okay.
And in it, the Prophet seemingly prohibits the renting out of fields.
It's pretty direct.
So just no renting fields at all.
Well, yeah, that's what it seems like on the surface.
Yeah.
So what I'm curious about is what was going on at that time that might have led to this prohibition? Like, was there something specific happening that they were trying to address?
Well, to understand that, I think we need to put ourselves back in that time,
Yeah.
We have to consider what the economic landscape of early Islam was like.
Yep.
And the main thing to remember is that back then, agriculture was the backbone of society.
It was how most people made a living?
It was how most people survived.
Right.
Right. So land ownership was a really big deal.
Yeah.
It was directly tied to power and social standing.
So if you owned a lot of land, you had a lot of power and influence.
You had a lot of influence. And imagine now, if you had this system where these powerful landowners, they're just allowed to rent out their land however they want, to whomever they want, on whatever terms they want.
There's a lot of potential for abuse there.
There's a huge potential for exploitation. You could have people who desperately need land to grow food for their families, forced into really unfair agreements,
Yeah.
Maybe they have to give up most of their harvest, or they end up in debt to the landowner. So this prohibition on renting land, I think it was meant to prevent that kind of exploitation.
It was about protecting the vulnerable, the people who didn't have as much power in that society.
Make sure that everybody had a fair chance to provide for themselves and their families.
So, yeah, I mean, it's about social justice, right? It's about making sure that the system itself isn't rigged in a way that benefits those who are already in power.
It's about fairness, and it's about recognizing that land in that context wasn't just a commodity, it was a lifeline.
Absolutely. But okay, so that makes a lot of sense to me. But here's where things get a little bit murky, maybe.
All right.
So Hansala, the one who narrated this hadith, he follows up. He asks Rafi about payment in gold and silver. And Rafi says that's permissible.
So it's not just a blanket ban.
Right. Yeah. So that raises a question, right? Is it just a blanket ban on renting land, or is it more specific? Is it about how the rent is paid?
That's a good question. And that's, I think, where we see that this issue isn't quite as simple as it might seem at first.
Okay.
And this is where I think the Muwatta Imam Malik really shines, because it doesn't just give us one answer. It preserves these different opinions and these different legal rulings from different scholars. So On this point about gold and silver, there were different interpretations.
Okay.
For example, we have Said Ibn Musayyab, who was a very prominent jurist of the time.
Okay.
And he said that there was nothing inherently wrong with renting land for gold or silver.
Interesting.
So this suggests that the concern might not have been about renting itself, but about the specific forms of payment.
Like what kind of potential for exploitation might exist?
Like maybe if the rent was tied to the harvest,
Right.
like with sharecropping, that could be really risky for the farmer because if the crops fail, they're still on the hook.
Exactly.
But with gold or silver, it's a fixed amount, regardless of the harvest.
So it's less dependent on the whims of nature, on the, the success or failure of a particular season.
Yeah. So maybe that's why Said Ibn al-Musayyab was okay with it?
Okay, so we have this one opinion that says, gold and silver's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes me think, okay, so was this like a common practice then?
It seems like it was.
Okay.
We also see Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar, another respected figure, expressing a similar view. No problem with renting for currency. And it wasn't just theoretical. Like the Muwatta even includes a story about Ar-Rahman ibn Auf, who's a companion of the Prophet. He rented land for a really long time and paid in gold or silver.
Wow. So this wasn't just like an abstract legal debate. It was like happening
in real life.
In real life.
People were doing this.
Yeah. That's amazing. So, okay, so let me just recap here.
Yeah, good idea.
We have this initial prohibition, right? Maybe aimed at preventing exploitation.
Yeah.
But then we have these other respected figures who are saying, well, actually, if you rent it for gold or silver, that's okay.
It's okay.
And then we have actual examples of people doing that.
Right.
So why the shift? Why do we have this apparent contradiction?
Well, I think it just shows how dynamic Islamic jurisprudence is. Interpretations, they evolve over time.
Yeah.
You have regional variations in practice. What might be problematic in one context, maybe where there's a history of landowners really taking advantage of people, might be perfectly acceptable in another context where those same risks aren't there.
And it reminds us that even within Islamic teachings, there isn't always this one rigid answer to everything.
It's not just black and white.
Right. It's not just like a yes or no.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the principles behind the rulings and applying them thoughtfully to the specific situation that you're in.
It's about looking at the context, the potential harms, and trying to find a solution that's just and fair.
So speaking of applying those principles, that brings us to Imam Malik himself, right?
Yes.
He's got his own opinion on this.
He does.
What does he say?
Well, he adds yet another layer to this whole discussion.
Okay.
Imam Malik disapproved of renting land for a fixed amount of produce.
Okay.
But he seemed to be okay with payment and currency.
So he's drawing a distinction between the two.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting because, I would think like, renting for produce, that seems kind of more in line with the
you think so?
With how things worked back then.
Yeah.
They're an agricultural society, so why would he be against that?
Well, I think this is where the concept of Ihsan comes in.
Okay.
Which, as you know, is a really important principle in Islam.
And can you remind us what exactly that means?
Yeah. Ihsan can be translated as like excellence, virtue, or like doing what's best in a given situation.
Okay.
It's not just about following the rules. It's about going above and beyond. It's about striving for fairness and compassion in all of our actions.
So how does that play out in the context of renting land?
Well, think about it. Let's say a farmer rents some land, right? And they agree to pay a fixed amount of produce as rent.
Okay.
But what if there's a drought?
Oh.
What if there's a plague of locusts and the harvest fails?
Yeah.
That farmer is still obligated to pay that agreed upon amount of produce.
Even though it's not their fault.
Even though it's completely outside of their control.
Wow.
And that could lead to them going into debt, maybe losing their livelihood. But if they pay in currency, it's a fixed amount.
Regardless of the harvest.
Regardless of what happens with the crops. So it's a more stable option.
Yeah.
It's a more equitable option for the farmer.
And it kind of protects them from those, things that are outside of their control.
Exactly.
So Imam Malik's distinction is really about prioritizing fairness, protecting the vulnerable, and that really aligns with the whole concept that they saw.
It's about doing what's best for everyone involved, even if it means going beyond the letter of the law.
So I feel like we've been on such a journey.
We have.
But just this one conversation.
Yeah.
We started with this like initial
Yeah.
seemingly strict prohibition on renting land, and then we have all these different opinions, and then we have Imam Malik's really nuanced view. And it shows that this whole issue of renting land was not a simple thing even back then.
No, and it raises some really important questions for us today.
Okay.
You know, how do these centuries-old debates inform our understanding of ethical land use today?
And how can we apply these principles
Exactly.
in a modern context?
We live in a very different world now
Yeah.
with complex economic systems, global trade, large-scale agriculture.
Yeah.
But I think those principles of fairness and Ihsan, that concern for protecting the vulnerable, I think they're still incredibly relevant.
Absolutely. I mean, it makes you think, what's our responsibility, not just as individuals, but as a society, to make sure that our economic systems are that they're equitable, that they're not exploiting people.
It's a great question to think about.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive
Of course.
into the Muwatta Imam Malik. It's just incredible how these ancient texts can still spark such relevant and important conversations.
Absolutely.
All right.